Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Ilia Lindsay, and I am a child and family psychologist and the head of psychology at Komodo. Komodo is the wellbeing solution for schools, helping schools to collect meaningful wellbeing data on both their staff and students. What we know from our experience and at the schools we support around the world is that meaningful wellbeing data translates into meaningful wellbeing intervention, allowing schools across the world to be more targeted, more effective, and more efficient when it comes to supporting their students and staff with all things wellbeing. Outside of my role at Komodo, my clinical background has seen me working in both community and hospital settings, supporting young people and their family with all things mental health and wellbeing. The combination of my work experience has allowed me to have a really unique insight and understanding into the experiences of students, but also the experiences of teachers and the current education landscape we find ourselves in. So, our session today is going to be all around how do we use science-informed, neuroscience-informed approaches to inclusive teaching and inclusive classrooms. I'm going to talk you through a very simple model where we learn how to regulate, relate, and then respond, which can improve and increase the inclusivity within your classroom environment. Before we go any further, I want to start with a simple but really powerful idea. Students learn best when they feel safe, connected, and seen. Now, this might sound straightforward and intuitive, but it's also deeply rooted in neuroscience and trauma-informed research. Today, we're going to explore why this is true and, more importantly, what we can do as educators actively in our classrooms to support students to feel this way. This session is really about bridging the gap between what we know about the brain and what we can do in the classroom. We are going to look at how stress and identity, lack of being seen, and alternatively, what being seen helps and hinders a student to engage and regulate in the classroom. We're going to look at how our everyday teaching practices have an opportunity to either support or potentially unintentionally hinder that process. My goal today is that you walk away with practical, usable tools, strategies that you can implement right away to strengthen the relationships, strengthen the emotional support and regulation, and ultimately strengthen the inclusivity across your learning environment. So why does this even matter? Let's start here. First of all, when we have inclusive practice, we promote belonging and safety. When students feel included, when they feel safe, they can be themselves and they can take part in learning. A sense of belonging is one of the strongest predictors to engagement in education as well as well-being. So when students feel accepted for who they are, they're more likely to ask questions. They're more likely to take risks. They're more likely to engage in the learning process, contribute to discussions, and build social and emotional relationships. Inclusivity builds psychological safety, which we're going to talk about soon, which is a foundation for learning. The next point we have on this slide is around inclusivity supports equity and access. Okay, so inclusivity is not about treating everyone the same. It's about giving every learner what they need to succeed. The type of relationship, the type of connection, the type of learning environment they need to succeed. Now, this can sometimes look like adapting materials, adapting teaching styles, adapting communication or classroom routines so that every student is able to access learning. Inclusive classrooms and by extension, inclusive teachers recognize this and try to reduce those barriers. We think of things physically, socially, culturally, or learning and linguistically so that all students have equal opportunities. The next point around why this matters so much is because inclusivity builds empathy and social skills. When students learn alongside other peers who come from different backgrounds, different languages, and have different abilities, we are able to develop empathy and perspective taking because we are forced and exposed to this repeatedly. Yeah, the social and emotional skills that can be created in this type of classroom environment prepare students for eventual diverse workplaces and global citizenship. The last point we have on this slide is around the reality that inclusivity improves learning outcomes. Okay, research shows that inclusion benefits everyone, not just students that have additional needs or minority backgrounds, but diverse classrooms foster richer discussion, more creative problem solving because there are more perspectives. Yeah, by extension, we create stronger collaboration, stronger communication skills. So, inclusive teaching improves academic achievement and social outcomes for all learners. When we understand inclusion like this, we can see how our practices can either support or hinder inclusivity, and therefore, by extension, learning outcomes. As I mentioned, students learn best when they feel safe, seen, and connected. This is not just a social and emotional idea. This is how the brain works. Okay, when a student's nervous system is regulated, when they feel emotionally safe and included, their brain is able to focus. It's able to take in new information. It's able to adapt and manage challenges. The opposite is also true. When a student feels unsafe, misunderstood, or disconnected, and whether that is because of stress or trauma or identity based exclusion, their brain prioritizes survival, not learning, not pro social behavior. So, inclusivity is all about creating conditions where learning is possible. And this goes from how we greet students to how we structure our classrooms to how we visually present things to even how we respond through behavior management styles. We have an opportunity with each interaction to either support regulation, connection, and inclusivity, or unintentionally increase stress, disconnection, and exclusion. So, what you'll find in this session is this is all about getting intentional. It's about understanding how the brain responds to stress and exclusion, and alternatively, also how it responds to inclusion. Yeah, and if we can understand trauma-informed practice and how this can then shape our classrooms, the goal will ultimately be today that you leave with some new ideas of what you can incorporate into your classroom. Because when students are regulated, connected, seen and included, they are not just more settled, but they're actually able to thrive. I just want to pause for a second because I realize I'm using a few terms, a few phrases, and I don't want to assume knowledge in this area. So, just quickly, just to define some of these key terms that keep coming up. Obviously, we have talked about inclusive teaching and inclusivity. Yeah, so this is about that intentional effort and structure and change in behavior to make sure every learner has an equal opportunity. This is not just a feel-good goal, okay? Inclusion directly impacts engagement of your classroom, motivation, and as we've just talked about, even academic success. Now, I've mentioned this a few times around trauma-informed or trauma-informed classrooms. Now, what we mean by this is these are environments that recognize the impact of trauma on how students learn, how they behave, how they communicate, or how they relate to others. Now, trauma can come from adverse childhood experiences, it can come from family stress, it can come from micro stresses within an environment or other system inequities or disruptions. Students who are affected by trauma are potentially are more easily triggered. They are more sensitive to unpredictability, or they can struggle to regulate emotions or attention. So, trauma informed practice is about responding with understanding and not judgment. It's about recognizing the importance of creating a safe and predictable environment that helps students feel secure enough to learn. Now, trauma informed practice and inclusivity often sit side by side because when a student feels excluded or unseen within their class or their school environment, this is an example of trauma. These micro traumas, these micro behaviors that happen day in and day out shape how a student's brain then reacts to their environment. Now, the other word that you will hear continuously coming up is this word of stress. Okay, it's a word that we hear very often and we don't often define it all that clearly. So when I'm talking about stress, we are talking about stress as the body and brain's natural response to a perceived threat or challenge. So stress is not inherently bad. In fact, some stress we know helps us to stay alert, helps us to stay motivated. But when stress is chronic, or overwhelming and unrelenting, it can disrupt the brain systems that are responsible for attention, memory, and emotion control, which is what makes it harder for students to engage or self regulate. Now, again, this leads into inclusive teaching and trauma-informed classrooms because if a student is repeatedly under stress, they are repeatedly experiencing trauma, there is a greater need for understanding rather than judgment, and there are more inclusive behaviours that we as teachers will need to put in place. This leads us to our final word on the slide, which is dysregulation. So, dysregulation and stress are often talked about hand in hand. So, dysregulation happens when a student's nervous system is overwhelmed, when the stress becomes too much and they are no longer able to manage their emotions or their behavior or their focus. So, when we're talking about dysregulation, we can see this in the classroom in kind of emotional outbursts. We can also see it in shutting down or zoning out, or just an increased irritability or energy physically within the body. So, this is also when we talk about dysregulation, we talk about the fight, flight, or freeze response, which I'm sure is familiar for many of you. Now, when we understand behaviors through a trauma-informed lens, we understand stress and we understand dysregulation through a brain-based perspective, we can see how our environment and our inclusive or lack of inclusive environment can really play a role in a student's presentation. So ultimately, what we do as educators either helps or hinders. Every interaction, every decision in the classroom can either support a student's ability to regulate, to connect, to be seen, or, as I said before, can unintentionally increase that stress, push a student closer to dysregulation and disengagement. So our goal is to get intentional. Let's get intentional about creating classrooms where students feel safe enough to thrive. So I'd like to take a minute now to talk you through something called the hand-brain model that Dan Segal has come up with. It's a simple but powerful way to understand what is happening in the brain when a student is learning, but also when a student is struggling and becoming distressed. Again, if we can understand this through a trauma-informed lens, this helps us to understand why students may think and behave and speak in certain ways. So if you were to take your hand, we take the base of your palm as representing the base of your skull. Now, this represents the survival part of your brain. So all the things we don't need to think about, your digestion, your circulation, your breathing, all of this is kind of controlled from this bottom survival part of the brain. Now, the next part of the brain we evolved is if you were to tuck your thumb in, you get the limbic system or the emotion center. So this is where fight, flight, or freeze is controlled from. The last part of the brain we evolved is if you were to tuck your fingers over, at the front, you get your prefrontal cortex, or your thinking brain. So we have survival brain, emotion brain, thinking brain. Now, the thinking brain on top is what helps us to manage communication, logic, learning, memory, recall, being able to take things that we've learnt and use it in adapting and problem solving. So when we are regulated, when students are seen, when they are connected, when they are included, we have a high chance that the brain is integrated and working well. The lid is down. All parts of the brains are talking to each other smoothly, efficiently, effectively. Now, as stress arrives in the environment, and this can come from those micro behaviors, these can come from a student with a learning difficulty, no longer being able to sit at the front of the class, so now cannot hear, now cannot process the information being given to them. This could be a student who walks in and recognizes that their culture isn't represented very much in this class or very much in this school. These are the kind of stresses that slowly build, and as they start to accumulate, the lid starts to glitch. And when we reach that threshold of dysregulation, when the stress is too much for the nervous system, the lid flips. And when the lid flips, it's like the brain wires stop talking smoothly to each other. So communication, logic, problem solving, pro-social behavior, all of that is now offline. The survival circuits, the emotion circuits have taken over and now they're running the show. When a student's lid flips, it's like the Wi-Fi has dropped out between the brain's networks. The signals aren't reaching the parts of the brain that help with logic or empathy or problem solving. So when students become dysregulated, they operate from these lower parts of the brain. Survival part of the brain, not designed for reasoning, not designed for effective communication. So if a student is flipped, and as teachers, we respond with logic, communication, or discipline first, we're speaking to a part of the brain that's completely offline. So instead, we need to focus on helping students feel safe, seen, and connected. We need to talk to the survival part of the brain. That is what is going to bring the thinking brain back online. And this is why inclusive practices are essential. They are essential for facilitating students to keep their lid on in the first place from a preventative measure, but also in supporting them to get it back down if the lid flips. Now, another way of understanding how we move from having the lid down to being in a flipped lid is by understanding what we call the window of tolerance. So, every human, every student wakes up each morning with a window of tolerance, a window of capacity that they can operate within. And when a student is within their window, they are able to stay engaged, emotionally present, cognitively flexible, and social in their behaviors. But when that window narrows, and this can be due to trauma, to stress, to exclusion, this could be because of sensory overwhelm, this can be because of learning difficulties, it could be because of lack of nutrition or lack of sleep. Okay, it doesn't take much as this window gets smaller to push a student out to being dysregulated. So the larger your window, the more capacity you have to keep your lid down, even in the face of adversity or in the face of stress. But as your window is smaller, and this can be students who every day show up with a smaller window based on their family or their home environment or their cultural experience within the place they live. Or these can be students with persistent learning difficulties or neurodiversity who are coming into a world where their brain doesn't match how the world has been set up around them. So their window is constantly being pushed smaller. So again, you can see why it is essential that we intentionally use inclusive practice. Each inclusive interaction or practice you're able to either do as a teacher or have in your classroom can increase that window of tolerance. So the good news is no matter how a student turns up, you have the opportunity to increase their window of tolerance through inclusive practice and inclusive interactions. So when we understand both the hand brain and the window of tolerance, suddenly we understand why certain students may act or behave the way that they do. We can also start to understand why certain things we do, which is what we're going to get into next, can either help or hinder that process. And what you will find as we move through these next slides is actually many of the strategies are simple yet effective. Now, I would like to take a second here before we go into those more practical strategies, just to connect the dots between that stress, identity, and inclusion. Okay, so one way to think of it from a neuroscience lens is when students are marginalized or are part of a minority group, and whether that is based on culture, ethnicity, learning needs, disability, gender identity, any aspect of who they are, researchers call this a vulnerability to a higher allostatic load. Now, an allostatic load is a term from neuroscience and medicine that describes the accumulative wear and tear that the body or brain go through as they are faced with chronic stress. Now, this stress can come from experiences both inside and outside the classroom, so facing discrimination, or navigating social exclusion inside or outside of your school community. Now, because of this increased load, these students' nervous systems may be more sensitive or reactive. Okay, so again, you start to hear the pattern of why trauma-informed practice is also really important. It's that same talk about sensitivity and reactivity in the brain. So things that might feel minor or manageable to others, like your tone of voice, or a curriculum where they don't recognize themselves or their identity, or even those kind of small microaggressions that can come almost accidentally out from peers, can suddenly push a student outside of their window of tolerance and making it harder for them to regulate, pay attention, or engage in learning. Okay, so this is why inclusion isn't just about fairness or equality. It's about equity, and it's deeply connected to regulation and well-being. Inclusion means we make intentional choices to try and reduce that allostatic load that sits on minority group students. Okay, and each choice we make helps build their identity, build their sense of inclusion, and reduce their stress. So, how do we do this? Let's get practical, and I'm going to talk you now through the regulate, relate, respond model. So, step one, when we're talking about inclusive practice, actually doesn't begin with the student at all or the classroom. It begins with you. And it begins with your ability to regulate or co regulate every student that is around you. So, co regulation is the bridge to self regulation. So, if we want our students to be regulated, no matter how or who they are and how they show up in our classroom, it starts with us. So when a student has flipped their lid, that prefrontal cortex or that thinking brain that handles logic and reasoning, it's offline. In that moment, no amount of communication, explanation, or reasoning is going to get through. So to support someone while they're flipped, we need to ground our nervous system and offer a lifeline through co-regulation. So neuroscience kind of shows us that students don't just listen to our words, they feel our state. Okay, we have these beautiful things called mirror neurons that activate when we are around people, which is why we say that emotion can be contagious. And if you have a strong relationship with your student, the strength of co-regulation is even greater. Okay, so our mirror neurons literally help students to mirror our emotion, our tone, our body language. So if we are anxious, they will pick up on that. If we are calm, they will start to settle. So a perfect example of this is if you are in a school, there's construction going on, and suddenly there's a loud noise in the classroom. What you will see is students will look to their strong relationships in the classroom, and this could be their peers or it could be their teacher, and then they will mimic and mirror what they see. If a teacher remains calm and says, "Oh, it's just the construction next door," a student remains calm. If the student's best friend beside them becomes tearful or fearful because it's a big response and a big anxiety reaction, it's likely that the student will escalate and try to match this. So it works in both directions, both for pleasant and unpleasant emotions. So when words don't work, when non-verbal communication will. Okay, so whether a student is dysregulated and flipped, whether language is a barrier, whether cultural understanding is a barrier, our non-verbal communication can carry across all of that, allowing us to be inclusive in our practice. Okay, our vagus nerve and mirror neurons are constantly scanning for safety in facial expressions, in posture, in voice and tone. So a calm and regulated presence of a teacher sends the clearest message of all to every student. I am safe, you are safe. I am settled, you can settle. So when teachers ask me, what do I say to help a student feel included? What's the script? Well, the real answer is it's not about words. The first step is throw them a lifeline of co-regulation. It's about how you stand. It's the look on your face. It's the softness in your tone of voice. That is what every student's nervous system is responding to. So, what this looks like in practice is when things can become difficult because I know the stresses that teachers are under, and it is hard to show up calm, cool, collected every minute of your school day. So, it's also about checking in on your own stress levels and your own lid, and if it is down. And if you are noticing a student needing extra support or needing inclusion, needing that kind of extra lifeline, first check in with yourself, slow your own breathing, lower your own shoulders, plant your feet, soften your tone. Your non-verbal communication is your first step to an inclusive environment. Through co-regulation, you can regulate an entire classroom, no matter who, what descriptors a student has. Okay, co-regulation is the one thing we all have access to and can make a huge difference to every single brain and nervous system that is in your classroom. So, step two of building inclusive practice is all about how we relate. And we mentioned this word at the very start, psychological safety and inclusion within the classroom. So, psychological safety means that we intentionally create an environment where students feel safe to take risks, to make mistakes, to participate without fearing any ridicule or negative consequence. Okay, so there's no backlash for taking risk or making mistakes. Now, when students feel safe in this way, their nervous system is no longer stuck in that survival mode or those lower parts of the brain. Their brains, the lid is on, the brain is integrated, they are ready to engage with learning. They're able to be curious, creative, and build social connections as well. Now, the flip side of this is neuroscience shows us that when students feel threatened, unsafe, unseen, that limbic system, or more specifically within that, we have a thing called the amygdala, which is the brain's alarm system. This takes over. It shuts down that prefrontal cortex. It shuts down the thinking brain. So the problem solving, the self-regulation all becomes harder and harder. When the amygdala is dominating, when there is no psychological safety, students cannot focus or regulate effectively. Flip side of this is when students do feel psychologically safe, when they're valued, when they're connected, the brain is integrated, it's online, they can learn, they can regulate, and they can relate to others. So research and kind of trauma-informed practices suggests there's kind of several key ingredients for creating this type of safety. So the first thing, very practical, predictable routines. If you know that you have a set structure of your school day or set classes within your school day or your school week, we reduce uncertainty. So that kind of weary part of the brain or that alert system can settle down because it's predictable. We know how this day goes. Yeah, so we're not leaking that kind of cognitive energy or adding to that allostatic load of what could be coming next. What do I have? I don't know. And the worry that can be attached or the stress that can be attached to that. So having predictable routines. Yeah. The second key ingredient is around your relational support and how your relationships are characterized. So we talk about needing warmth, validation, and genuine connection. Okay, so being able to get to know your students, being able to know about their life outside of the classroom, have a relationship that is characterized by warmth. Again, when we have a relationship that is characterized by warmth and connection, those survival parts of the brain settle down and we get the lid down. So we have that predictable environment, we have warm relationships that all settle that survival part of the brain. Now, the last key ingredient is just really around respect and kind of affirmation of students' identities. So what we mean by that really is helping students to see themselves being reflected and valued. Yeah, so being able to see their culture in the classroom if possible, or celebrate certain days that may be important within their family or their community. Being able to kind of outside of identity of culture, it's about identity of self and being able to name your strengths, recognize your strengths, and celebrate your strengths. Okay, now these kind of key ingredients, again, very intuitive. Yeah, have a predictable routine, be warm and genuine, and affirm and praise the strengths of students so they feel able and feel recognized. Yeah. Practically speaking, kind of how we do this, and this is what I was saying before about these very simple, straightforward practices. Something as simple as greeting students by name each day, getting the pronunciation of their name correct, acknowledging effort, praising small things that you see going well, name and validate emotions. Yeah. These very simple, practical tools make a massive difference in how we relate to our students and how our students relate to us. Hearing a teacher recognize me by name settles my survival part of the brain. I feel seen, I feel recognized, and I build my sense of belonging with this person who knows me. Yeah. If I am being praised and I am being seen for the effort that I am putting in rather than just the outcome at the end, I build my sense of relationship and connection with my teacher or with my school and my classroom. The last kind of tip on there is around offering that choice and having student voice within your learning and class environment. Now, I know school environments. It can't be a predictable routine every single day, and it may be hard to greet every single student as they come in. And that's okay. But if we are intentionally striving for this, this can make a big difference. Okay, we're not going to get it right 100% of the time. That's okay. That's okay. But if we can shift our intention and shift our focus to trying to implement these small, easy behaviors within our classroom, we can see a massive, massive difference and a big change in behavior, engagement, and self-regulation within our classroom. So, in short, when we talk about psychological safety, this is the foundation for everything else. Yeah, if your classroom has that predictable nature, if you have a predictable nature and you are building relationships, you are going to be more effective at the slide we just looked at, which was co-regulation. Yeah, psychological safety underpins all of this. If you build genuine connections, students feel safe. If they are seen in their class and they can recognize their strengths, their culture, their identity within your classroom, they feel safe. Yeah, all of this then leans into that non-verbal safety kind of anchor line we have with co-regulation. Okay. Put time and effort into building psychological safety and you will reap the benefits. Now, our third and final step around kind of inclusive practices is about how we respond. And it's about responding with curiosity rather than reactivity or when we're reacting from kind of stress or judgment. So, reactivity happens when we respond automatically from our own stress, from our own frustrations or our own assumptions. So, for example, if a student interrupts or kind of challenges a rule that you might have in your classroom, it's very easy to kind of immediately just kind of reinforce it and no, this is what we do, and kind of enforce that compliance with the school rule or the class rule without really stopping to understand or be curious about why the student might be asking that. And when we jump to that reactivity, it often escalates tension, which then reduces engagement from that student and then can unintentionally marginalize students. And this is especially important to recognize for those who already feel vulnerable or carry that higher allostatic load or that cumulative stress. So, how we respond in an inclusive manner is about responding with curiosity. It's being able to pause and observe and kind of genuinely seek to understand that student's experience. It means asking open and validating questions. You know, if the same student is kind of questioning why we're doing things and then kind of not starting the task that's being put in front of them at their desk, instead of going over and saying, we said, like, why haven't you started? We started 5 minutes ago. Come on, let's get going. It's going in with curiosity. I noticed you haven't started yet. Can you tell me what's going on for you? So suddenly, instead of coming in with reactivity and kind of enforcing compliance, which we know if someone is feeling disconnected and disengaged there, we start to add to that potential of a lid flip. Or if we go over and kind of genuine connection, psychological safety, kind of I'm aware of my non-verbals that I'm giving off. I just noticed that you haven't started yet. What's going on for you? Suddenly you open the door for a conversation for a student to possibly say, I didn't understand what you were asking, or I was distracted and I'm not too sure where to start. Or, there could have been a difficult morning, a difficult lunch break, a difficult allostatic load building on the student, and that's why they're having trouble to engage. So rather than reacting and assuming things like defiance, we want to go with curiosity and be open to what students may be bringing. So this kind of curious approach directly supports inclusion. Students from diverse culture or linguistic or neurodiverse backgrounds may express stress or emotions differently than we expect. And if we respond reactively, we really risk alienating or misinterpreting them. And this is where that kind of unintentionalized marginalization comes in. Curiosity helps us to recognize context. It helps us to honor identity in some situations, and also just validates a student's experience. It continues to build that sense of safety and connection between me and my student. Yeah. An important point to bring up here is that teachers can only respond with curiosity if they are self-regulated. So again, this is about tuning into your own stress signals and choosing to pause before reacting or going into a conversation. So when we combine these three steps, we regulate through nonverbals and that lifeline of co-regulation. We build relationships through connection, belonging, psychological safety, and inclusion. And then we can respond more curiously or thoughtfully. Suddenly, we are creating classrooms where every student has the best chance to regulate, engage, connect, and really thrive. Now, a key thread that you would have heard over those last three slides is it's only possible to do this if we are looking after ourselves as teachers. So, how do we reduce your reactivity, your stress load? And so it is really important to recognize this as teachers. And I have a good understanding of what that kind of day-to-day stress can really feel like and how it can fluctuate as well across a school year or even just a school term. So just some quick tips here around taking care of your own well-being, because this is not just for your own personal benefit. It's going to directly impact the way that you support your students, and how you do your job effectively in a proud manner. So when you maintain your own regulation, when you become steady, you can be that calm anchor for your classroom and therefore be able to access these potential inclusive strategies. So I've just added on the slide a couple of quick practical ways to reset your own nervous system during the day. And these are things that you can do even within lessons or just between lessons, when you just need a brief pause to drop your anchor and kind of get your own lid back down. So the first one on there, which may be familiar to you, is box breathing. So a really simple technique where you breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, hold for 4. And we build that box as we breathe. You don't need to build the box with your finger, you can visualize it, but by using a box to settle our breath in for 4, hold for 4, release for 4, hold for 4. It slows down our heart rate and helps bring our nervous system back to a state of settled or regulated. Yeah, breath work in particular really soothes that part of the limbic system. It helps signal to that part of the brain that we're okay, we're settled, the lid can come back online. Now, the next suggestion I have on there may also be familiar to you. It's a mindfulness exercise or a grounding exercise through your sensory system. So we simply take the numbers 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we work through our sensory profile. So the first thing you do is you look around and you see if you can find 5 particular things. So you might pick 5 blue things in your classroom or 5 squares, but use your sight to identify 5 things. From there, I ask you to close your eyes. And for 4, we want to notice 4 different sensations across your body. Can you feel glasses across your nose bridge? Can you feel where your jacket might be sitting on your shoulders? kind of move through a bit of a body scan and just pick up 4 different sensations across your body. Then we keep our eyes closed, and for 3, we want to see if we can hear 3 different sounds. Then we move to 2, seeing if we can smell 2 different smells. And then the last one, we try and pick up 1 taste that is left in our mouth. Now, as you move through that sensory system, it helps you to bring your attention back to the present moment, away from any stresses. And again, by regulating our sensory system, we soothe those lower parts of the brain and help our own brain to come back online. So these small, consistent nervous system resets throughout your day can really help teachers to continue to show up with that curiosity, to be able to maintain these inclusive practices and model emotion regulation or be available for co-regulation. Now, these extra practices don't take a lot of time. They can be embedded into natural transitions or breaks within your day. So I'd really encourage you to reflect on your school day and see where you could find places to weave this in. Because when you regulate yourself first, you set your tone for your whole classroom, creating that safer, calmer, regulated space where all students can regulate and engage in learning. So again, we bring it all together with that very simple but powerful framework of regulate, which reminds us that regulation and connection begins with us. Okay, we have the opportunity to be the thermometer in the room. We set the temperature for where a class is going to be. Okay, no matter what your background, what your particular diverse needs may be, you respond to nonverbal co-regulation. Okay, and that hand-brain model and understanding the window of tolerance helps us to understand how that lower part of the brain really relates to this. That next step was around relating, building relationships, building predictability, building an environment where students can feel seen, respected, and included. Okay, this really helps, particularly for students with that higher allostatic load, to help them to be able to engage in their classroom. Finally, that respond slide is all around pausing and responding with curiosity first, rather than coming from a more reactive place. When we can respond in that way, it helps us really understand a student's experience and opens the door to continue to build that connection with a student as well. And these 3 steps together help create that positive cycle, that positive environment where a student's nervous system can stay regulated, their identities are honoured, and learning can really flourish. So the last thing that I will leave you with is with inclusion. Like any skill, it must be taught, it must be modeled, it has to be practiced. Okay, inclusion is a process, it is not a checklist. And we don't just declare that we have inclusion, it is something that students feel in our classroom or in our presence. So the more that we lead with connection, curiosity, and these inclusive practices, the more we model that for our environment. So all students can pick up on these behaviors, all students can play a part of building this inclusive environment in the classroom. Thank you for joining me for this session. I hope that these tools are practical with some very quick and easy tips that you can create and use in your classroom from today. Go well, good luck, and I hope that you're able to use this to create a classroom where every student can feel safe, connected, seen, and ready to thrive. Thank you.